Yep, that's fine.
Okay, so good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to the second webinar of the series Multi-Scale Phenomena and Continuum Mechanics, Singular Limits of Equilibrium and Transitions. Our first speaker today is Professor Jonathan Potts from the Department of Applied Mathematics of the University of Sheffield. Professor Potts is a leading expert in mathematical biology with a special focus on the formulation and analysis of mathematical models in ecological systems. Particular his research interests on the effect of environmental changes on survival of population, biological invasions, and spatial population dynamics. So today, his talk will be on multi-species model with non-local advection, linking animal movement to spatial population dynamics. So please, Jonathan, you have roughly 40 minutes for your talk.
Okay, great. Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. So yeah, this is a series on continuum mechanics. I can't say I'm going to talk at all about continuum mechanics. It's going to be mainly sort of ecological motivations, but it is to do with partial differential equations. So hopefully it will be of general interest to the audience. So I'm going to start off with a question. Oh, is this working? There we go. Right, good. That's what I wanted to happen. Okay, so I'm going to start off with a question from ecology and look at kind of how ecologists, by which I mean sort of empirical ecologists, tend to answer it. So the question is, how do animals arrange themselves in space? And the typical way in which your sort of working empirical ecologist will look at this is by constructing a model of space use. So U of x is a function of space use. They'll say that U of x is proportional to the quality of resources at that point in x multiplied by the availability of the resources. So they think very much about understanding space use in terms of the underlying sort of environment. So here's a sort of example map of what W of x might look like. This is a range of a caribou herd in Newfoundland, and these are the sort of different qualities of the various different types of resources. So you often see in ecological papers kind of maps like this one, and then there's some sort of availability. So in this case, this may be demarcated by this wiggly line where everywhere where it's not white demarcates the availability of space to this caribou herd. So that's kind of how sort of ecologists tend to model species distributions and tend to think about species distributions. But of course, there's some sort of underlying sort of problems with this. One is that animals move to arrange themselves in space, so they don't just sort of decide where they're going to be and teleport there. They have to move. And in particular, as well as moving in response to the landscape, they will move in response to the presence of other species or populations or individuals. So, for example, with these caribou, there are coyotes and bears living in this area in Newfoundland that can predate on caribou, particularly caribou calves, and the caribou might want to avoid those kind of areas. So that's the presence of other species, the presence of other populations. There are other caribou herds. So this is the range of one herd. There might be another caribou herd up here in the top right-hand corner. I hope, can you see my cursor, by the way? I'm moving my cursor up here. Can people see that? Maria, if you could.
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, good. I just wanted to check that at the start.
Yes.
People can see what I can see.
Before we didn't hear you perfectly from time to time, but now it seems everything is okay.
Okay. Well, I'll carry on, and yeah, let me know if things get bad. Sometimes I end up shouting into the microphone, which causes a I'll try not to do that.
No, it's fine. We can hear and we see your cursor.
If I get too excited, I shout into the microphone. But okay, so what was I saying? So yeah, there may be other populations that affect their movement. So there's another caribou herd, I think, living up here that affects where this herd who live down here live. And of course, individuals, they move in herds. The individuals affect their movement. And so this can generate kind of feedback loops. So for example, individuals of one species may move in response to the presence of another species B, and in turn, individuals from species B move in response to the presence of species A. So you can think of prey species being sort of moving away from a predator species and the predator species moving towards the prey, or whatever, or competitive species mutually avoiding one another, and so on and so forth. So what I'm interested in and what I'm going to look at in this talk is trying to understand how to model these kind of feedback loops between the locations of different species or populations, or indeed individuals, and how they affect the sort of spatiotemporal patterns of animal distributions. Okay, so yeah, and yeah, this is as I'm giving away the punchline here. They can generate complex spatiotemporal dynamics. That's what I'm going to kind of show. So, how do we model something like this? Well, it helps sometimes not to be. I've talked about caribou and so forth. It helps not to be too tied down to a specific species. So one might think of a more generic example, which is, of course, dragons. So consider a population of dragons. And dragons, as we know, like to chase princesses. So you can draw an arrow down from the dragons to the princesses. The princesses don't really like this, so they will move away from the dragons. But princesses do like to play with fairies, as we all know. So they will tend to move towards where fairies are. Fairies kind of quite like playing with princesses. They're a bit more cool than princesses, so you know their attraction towards where the princesses are is perhaps a little less. So we might represent this by thin. And dragons, if they can't eat a princess, they'll go and eat a fairy. So they might have some tendency to move towards where the fairies are as well, and the fairies don't like that. So this kind of
Sorry, Jonathan, we don't hear you. Sorry, we don't hear you very well. So maybe it could be better if you could shut the camera.
Shut the camera down. Yeah, I'll do that.
Let's try if this improves the quality of the sound.
Yeah, we'll go like that. Okay. Thanks for letting me know. So this kind of obviously sort of cartoon example demonstrates or gives a sort of example of the sort of thing that you often see in nature: various different populations moving in response to the presence of others. And what I'm going to focus on is actually their movements. So although I've said, you know, dragons may eat princesses, we're not actually going to be thinking about the sort of births and deaths of animals, but simply how they move in response to one another. And that's the kind of idea that we're going to model. So this is a schematic of the model. So how do we turn that into mathematics? No, I'm a slide ahead of myself. So I'll turn that into mathematics in a minute. But before we do so, there are basically three different types of interactions that we can identify, or we can classify in these kind of schematics. One is mutual attraction, which looks like this. So U1 tends to move towards U2, and U2 tends to move towards U1. Mutual avoidance, where they tend to move away from one another, and sort of chase and pursuit, where U1 moves towards U2 and U2 tends to move away. So mathematically, it's quite straightforward to add self-attraction and self-repulsion, which are not, they're not interactions as such between populations. But, So that's so we can also have these. So this kind of represents all the sort of possible things that we're trying to model mathematically. I'm going to get some equations now. Yeah. So how do we turn this into maths? So if we let U1 to UN be probability density functions of n populations, and we're going to assume, I'll say this again because this is important, we're going to assume that they're a fixed size. So there's no births or deaths taking place here. We're looking over timescales where we're just concerned with the movements of animals. So timescales where births and deaths are negligible, therefore mathematically assumed to be 0. So for this, we construct a system of advection diffusion equations. So here's the diffusion, and here's an advection term, and this represents advection up the gradient of AI, where AI is some, I'm using as a placeholder, to be some sort of function that depends upon the presence of the other populations. So, so then the next question is, well, how exactly do we define AI? So there's various ways in which we can do it. The first one, the first scenario, is that to imagine that individuals from a population can respond directly to the distribution of other populations. So here, AI will be some weighted sum of the various populations, UJ. And you'll notice that I put a little bar over there. Well, what does that mean? Well, this is where the non-locality comes in, because animals will not, when they're responding to things, they will not just look directly at their feet, but they will have some sort of perceptual radius around them, which they will be looking at to determine their movement. So this U bar denotes a convolution of UJ with some averaging kernel K. So star here is a convolution. And for at least the first part of the talk, we're going to choose, so this spatial averaging kernel, I should say, in general, it's going to be some probability density function that is has mean 0. But for at least the first part of this talk, we're going to choose K to be the indicator function on some ball of radius delta. So B delta 0 is a ball of radius delta around 0. And so the convolution of K and UJ is just the integral of that ball around the point X. Okay, so so here's where the sort of promised in the title non-local advection. Here's the non-local term, and it comes inside A, which is advection. So there we go. This non-local advection. That's what we have here. Okay, so yeah, so we're going to choose this example K, and then, but in principle, you can choose other spatial averaging kernels if needs be. Okay, how's the sound doing, Maria? Is it okay? Is it become bearable?
It's a little bit better than before. From time to time, it's not perfect, but I think you can go ahead.
It's workable. Okay.
Yes, it's workable. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Good. I hope it remains workable. Okay. I'll carry on anyway. I can't tell, so I might as well just carry on. So another way we can model interactions between populations of animals is, and this is perhaps a little bit more ecologically common, certainly in larger sort of vertebrate animals, is that they interact indirectly. So, for example, animals may leave traces of where they've been through urine or feces, or sometimes just through sort of footmarks or treading down the terrain. So AI can represent the presence of other animals' marks. So here we have this, we've introduced this function pi, and pi increases when the other animals are present and decreases naturally over time. So, for example, you can think of the decay of the scent marks as being this mu pi. So it doesn't have to be scent marks, but if it makes things easier, you can think of these as scent marks. You think of P as P, in fact. So the third scenario that we might want to model is where there are direct interactions with animals, so they actually meet one another and therefore know the presence of the other animals. And then there is some memory that the animals have of having seen those other animals. So there's some sort of prolonged response. They don't just respond to the presence of the animal immediately, but it's a sort of prolonged response. So we can measure this as Ki, and Ki grows when the animals meet each other. So members of population I meet members of population J, and it decays when members of population I go into this sort of region of interaction and but don't have encounters. So it's a kind of way of detecting where the sort of perhaps where the safe region is or something like this. So and there's a sort of implicit assumption in here that the animals within a population are able to sort of communicate the presence of others to one, communicate their sort of memory of the presence of others to one another. So it's a kind of communal memory, which is often reasonable in sort of territorial groups or something like this, quite small groups. Might not be so applicable in a full species, but anyway. So these are the three kind of ecological models we have. And it turns out that because of the sort of functional forms I've chosen, we can take an adiabatic approximation, so assume that Pi or Ki equilibrate much faster than Ui. And then all three of these situations kind of collapse down into one example. Right? So if you set this dki by dt to 0 or dpi by dt to 0, then you basically have the weighted sum of uj's is equal to mu of pi, and by transforming your parameters, you end up with a single equation that models each of these three scenarios. So the details of how to sort of do all the jiggery-pokery with the parameters is given in this paper down here, which was published a couple of years ago. So this is the sort of study model then for, I guess, the rest of the talk. And it's worth emphasizing that, of course, the diffusion constants are always positive, dA, but gamma ij can be positive or negative. D1 happens to be 1 due to the non-dimensionalization. Okay. So that's our study species. You know, have a little look at that whilst having a drink of water.
Jonathan,
So, yeah.
sorry for interrupting you. There are problems with your with the sound. It's not
Okay.
only for me. In the chat, they are alerting me that the sound, the quality of the sound is pretty bad.
Okay.
Is anything you can do to fix that?
I mean, it might be the connection, it might be the microphone. I can try another microphone. There's a microphone on here. I'll see if I can connect.
Let's try.
It might be worth a try. It might just be the connection, in which case I can't do much. I don't know how to. Okay, so I've got a slightly different microphone here. I don't know if that's changing things at all.
To me now it's much better than before.
Is it better than before? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Well, hopefully.
Let's try with this. Yes.
I'm afraid for some reason I can see the chat if I want. Yeah. Oh, there
yes,
are.
I will ask and let you know, but I think that now it's better.
Okay, I haven't been keeping an eye on the chat. I'm afraid there's too many things. Okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Let's see how things go. I'll maybe chat for 5 minutes or 2 or 3 minutes, and then ask you again and see if it's continued. Okay. But
Yeah.
it sounds okay for now, does it?
Now it's fine. Now
Okay.
everything is saying that it's better.
Okay. Right. Well. Right. This is the new world. New world.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So where was I? So yeah. So just let's go back. Just recap. Where was I? So I was saying that. Oh, hang on. Where are we? Oh no, I've no longer got my keyboard. Right. So this is our study system, our generic study system. We're going to start by looking at some simple cases. So we're going to start by looking at the case n equals 2, and we're going to assume that gamma 1 1 equals gamma 2 2 equals 0. So here's our full dimensionless system in that particular case. And of course, the best way to start off with is by doing some sort of linear stability analysis to see when you're going to expect patterns to form. So this is the linear stability analysis we do, and what we get are pattern formation matrix. You've got a kappa squared, where kappa is the wave number, and then your matrix has these interesting sinc functions in. So this is sine of kappa delta over kappa delta. And in the small delta limit, you get a very nice kind of classification of when you get patterns, in this case, which is as long as gamma 1 2 and times gamma 2 1 is greater than d2. Right? So that's quite nice. So we can immediately start to examine this sort of numerically a little bit, and we get three different pattern regimes, which are exactly the three kind of mentioned three types of they correspond exactly to the three types of interactions mentioned before. So as long as so we can get mutual attraction when gamma is positive, we can get mutual avoidance when gamma is negative, and then we can get the gamma 1 2 and gamma 2 1 positive, you get mutual attraction. When they're negative, you get mutual avoidance. Then when one is negative and one is positive, you can get a chase and pursuit type situation. And it turns out that the mutual attraction situation gives you this kind of aggregation of the two populations. The mutual avoidance gives you a sort of segregation pattern. Chase and pursuit actually doesn't give you any patterns at all. So you might have these two are kind of perhaps obvious and expected. You might have expected that the chase and pursuit situation, where gamma 1 2 and gamma 2 1 have different signs, might give you sort of one hump chasing another hump across the train. This doesn't actually happen, although if you were to include a self attraction on U1 and U2, you can get this to happen, but we have assumed that we don't have self attraction at the moment. So in that case, you don't get any patterns. How are we doing for the sound, Maria? Has it become better?
Yes, now it's perfect. It's
okay, great.
Very clear, loud and clear.
Yeah. So I don't use Zoom very much, although when I have used it, it's been fine with my laptop microphone, but there have been some platforms where my laptop microphone hasn't been so good. Anyway, okay, so this is resolved. Good. So we've done some pattern formation analysis and a bit of numerics in this simple case. We can also get a bit more of a handle on these patterns by looking at by constructing an energy functional in the case when gamma 1 2 equals gamma 2 1 and d2 equals 1. So here the system looks like this, and it's actually the symmetry of the system allows us to write down this energy functional, and this decreases over time and is bounded below, and it reaches a minimum where these two equations hold. And so what you can do is you can have a little look at those equations, And you find that if gamma is greater than naught, then du2 by dx has the opposite sign to du1 by dx. I should add actually briefly here that this is assuming that u1 is positive. I will later declare a proof of that. So that is, you can, as long as the initial data are positive, then u1 will be positive for all time. So that's fine. And therefore, if gamma is greater than naught, then the gradients have the same sign. So you expect a kind of aggregation pattern to form. And when it's less than naught, they have an opposite sign. So you expect to see segregation patterns. So the linear pattern formation analysis tells you when patterns can form, and this energy functional analysis tells you whether they should be aggregation or segregation patterns in this simple example. So that's quite nice. Oh dear, that something's gone horribly wrong with that image. Yeah, this thing on the left-hand side is not meant to look like that. I don't know what's happened there. It was the it's meant to look like this. So where am I? My computer's going funny. There. So it's meant to look like this thing on the left-hand side. So remember that image from the left-hand side, and then we'll move forward a few slides. And here we go. So when gamma is greater than naught and gamma squared is greater than d2, we have this mutual attraction. And this, you can kind of see this from the structure of the energy functional. And similarly for mutual avoidance. Okay, so I can't actually read the top of my screen anymore. What does it say? It says the case, it says something. Oh, n equals 3, right? Gamma II equals 0. Right, okay. So we've looked at the n equals 2 case, and we can kind of understand that pretty much completely, at least when gamma 1, 1 and gamma 2, 2 are 0. N equals 3, things start to get a little bit more complicated. So I'm going to show what happens here. So here's our full dimensionless system once more. And we're assuming that the gamma II is a 0 for simplicity. So we've got j not equal to I there. And again, we can do a little bit of linear pattern formation analysis. We get all these sort of sinc functions coming in again. And it turns out that depending on the parameter values, it's actually possible to have both a sort of Turing bifurcation, stationary bifurcation, where you have real and positive eigenvalues. So that you had that in the n equals 2 case, but you can also get non-real eigenvalues with positive real parts. So these are sometimes called Turing-Hopf bifurcations, or sort of oscillatory bifurcations, or something like this. And this is not possible for n equals 2. So we've already sort of, just by doing the simple linear pattern formation analysis, we see a bit of extra complexity apparent in the n equals 3 system that is not there in the n equals 2 system. So let's look at a couple of numerical simulations. And when we examine the numerical simulations, we can sometimes see things that look like pretty nice sort of traveling wave type things. I had a go at trying to see whether I could find some sort of traveling wave solution, or at least in a linear limit, and it's not straightforward actually. But these they look like traveling waves anyway, so I can't say anything rigorous about that. And then in other parameter regimes, you can see things that are sort of a lot less regular, sort of rather more complicated looking patterns. So how can we make sense of this? How can we make sense of this, at least using numerics? Oh, actually, yeah, here we go. So this is just some eye candy. Here's the bottom simulation from before that showed over time. So we've got 3, sorry about the lack of axes here, terrible. Shouldn't, any students watching this is bad practice. But the bottom axis is space, and the vertical axis are the 3 populations. So you can see that you get some quite kind of rich spatiotemporal dynamics that can come out of
this n=3 situation. And there's no births or deaths here. This is just all to do with how the animals move in response to one another. How long does this go on for? It goes on a long time. Let's move on. It's nice to watch. If I can get it to move on. There we go. So how do we analyze this kind of thing? Well, one way of analyzing these complex spatiotemporal patterns numerically is to examine a single point in space. So in this case, we look at x=0.5, and then we plot what happens to u1, u2, and u3 over time, and we sort of try and get to a stage where it seems to be settling down to an attractor. So in this top case, the attractor is this nice little closed loop. And in the bottom case, this attractor, if this is indeed the attractor, if it's got there, it's difficult to tell, but you know, it looks pretty irregular, pretty difficult to make a lot of sense of. So we can do some sort of slightly more careful numerical bifurcation analysis, which just kind of mimics what you would do with ODEs, really. And you start off by moving through the bifurcation point and then slowly increasing one of the parameter values. This case we used gamma1, 2, and you see first a little loop emerging, and then what looks like a sort of period doubling bifurcation somewhere around D, and then another period doubling bifurcation, which is either at G or H, depending on how good your eyesight is. I think it's somewhere at G, and then it starts to get pretty irregular. So so this is kind of a familiar sort of pattern that I'm sure many of you have seen in kind of ODEs and in reaction diffusion systems, but here it is in a sort of advection, non-local advection diffusion system, which is quite interesting. Okay, so that's a little bit about, so far I've kind of pushed forward with a bit of numerics and just some sort of linear pattern formation analysis. What about formal mathematical properties? So to help me with those, I hired this lady here, Valeria Junta, who many of you know, who's a postdoc with me since January, and we've been working on this. We've just put a first paper on the archive. So trying to look at some of the formal properties of this system, put some kind of solid mathematical grounding to our numerical observations and our observations of patterns. So this is what we've done so far. We've started with there's the generic system, and if we define it on an n torus T with, so that's just a hypercuboid with periodic boundary conditions. And informally, theorem 1 says that there are local in-time solutions in arbitrary spatial dimensions, and we've been able to prove that there are global positive solutions in one dimension. So I mentioned before that we needed positivity for some of our energy functional analysis. So we've proved that now, which is nice. So, however, one thing we weren't able to do was use our favorite averaging kernel K. We actually needed to use a twice differentiable kernel for this particular proof. So that's slightly annoying. The proof relied upon an estimate for the L infinity norm of grad K, but it's not too bad because ecologically this is no different to some sort of smooth approximation of this, so that's fine. So we were happy with that proof. It was a bit annoying we couldn't prove it in this case, but one thing that is kind of interesting about this is that because the proof requires this this property, you clearly can't have K being a delta function, right? So it's Dirac delta function. Why is that important? Well, if K was a Dirac delta function, then this term up here would no longer be non-local. This would just collapse to grad of uj. So it's quite important that you have something here, some K, some non-local term here in order to make the problem well posed. So so that's all a bit informal. This is for those who like some more details on exactly what the theorem says. This is what it says. So we start off with initial conditions in H2 on the torus, and then for arbitrary spatial dimensions n greater than or equal to 1, there is some time and a unique solution valid up until that time t star, such that the solution is in H2, and the time derivative of the solution is in L2. Okay, that's what this is saying. And then in n equals 1, so why could we go further in n equals 1? Well, we could use the Sobolev embedding of H2 into C1, and then once we have that Sobolev embedding into C1, we're actually able to crank it up into C2 and prove that it's not just in C1 but in C2. So we only have that Sobolev embedding for one spatial dimension. So but anyway, when we do have one spatial dimension, we can find a unique solution that is in C2, and we can also use that fact to prove that it's positive. Yeah, as long as the initial condition is positive, that's the criteria. Okay, so so that was quite nice. So we started to sort of put some formal mathematical grounding to some of these observations, and we're currently looking at kind of the structure of or extending the energy functional analysis to understand a bit more formally the structure of the attractor in certain cases. So Valeria's working on that at the moment, and doing a very fine job, I must say, in her postdoc, which is good to see. Good. So that's about all I had to say. I should thank various people. I've mentioned Valeria already. Thomas Hillen and Mark Lewis have been sort of collaborators on. Well, Mark's been a collaborator on all of this work actually, and Thomas has come in recently to sort of lend a hand on some of the sort of more formal mathematics. So it's been great to have him along. Oh, and Uli Schley. Oh, this is an old slide actually. I didn't end up. I was going to mention the work with Uli, so and then I took it out because I realised I wouldn't have enough time. But now I've got 5 minutes more. I'll explain why I've put Uli's picture up there. So alongside this, as well as doing sort of applied maths work, I like to try and figure out how to fit my models to data, and Uli has been helping me with that and with providing some data. So that's in some completely different work, which I originally mentioned, but I was originally going to mention, but realised my talk would be too long, so I didn't in the end. But anyway, she's still there, so that's good. So in summary, interspecies movement responses can result in complex spatiotemporal population patterns. So, and again, I should remind you that this is the movement response. It's nothing to do with the sort of births or deaths. This is just about movements and interactions. So those on their own can result in complex spatiotemporal population patterns. And I've proposed a sort of PDE tool, multi-species non-local advection diffusion systems, for analysing the effect of such movements on population dynamics. And there's a few references. I apologise that the sound has not been good. I don't know what I can say about that, but I hope I hope it was sufficiently good for a sufficient amount of the talk for you to be able to pick up something. And if you haven't, then read these papers.
Yeah. The quality of the sound was fixed right soon. You can switch your camera on if you want now, Jonathan. Yes.
Okay, I think. Oh yeah, so, there.
Good. So thank you very much for your very nice talk. It was very interesting, and the sound was pretty soon fixed. So and you ended up perfectly in time. So we have a few minutes for some questions. If Is there anyone who wants to make comments or ask something to Jonathan?
Yeah, I have a question, if I can ask. The kernel, you certainly said that you assume it to be positive, right? And
the kernel, K.
Meaning that the interaction is. So what if the kernel is for example, is a Mexican hat, something like you see in neural dynamics. So there is some kind of attraction for short range attraction and long-term repulsion or something like that. Or maybe there is a switching between, when it's overcrowded, then there is a repulsion effect, and then when it is not too crowded, then maybe an attraction. I think that has some ecological meaning, because species sometimes tend to stay together unless it's the density is too high. So is it too challenging from the mathematical point of view, you think, or?
Yeah, I mean, so I haven't looked at that explicitly, but others have. So there's a paper by Chad Topaz and I think Andrea, what's her name? Can't remember the other authors. Mark Lewis is one of the authors. Andrea Bertozzi, I think is her name, something like that. Anyway, in 2006, in Bulletin of Mathematical Biology, that looks at this kind of thing, but they look at it from a perspective of, and I think there's some other papers as well. Probably Jose Carrillo's looked at this kind of thing as well, I think. But I think most of those works, or at least all the ones that I know, look at it in terms of looking at one species. So, and what happens to how that affects the aggregation patterns. If you've got one species and this self-aggregation, that may be aggregation at small, well, maybe aggregation at longer distances and repulsion at small distances, as you were saying, or something like this. So yeah, that has been done. I mean, so in principle, one could put that into the multi-species case. I just haven't done it. I think there's an awful lot to do with just a positive kernel, I think. So, but yeah, that certainly would be an interesting idea. I've no immediate intelligent comments about how that might affect the pattern formation properties or anything, I have to say. But yeah.
Other comments or questions?
I was maybe if was funny. So you show those solutions which apparently seemed very highly irregular, right, from the temporal point of view. But is there something intermediate which you have something oscillating with periodically and then regularly? I mean, and then there is some threshold which you pass to some more chaotic behavior. Oh, okay, yeah. So you have it.
I mean, I guess it's it's this slide here. Yeah, it seems to be some sort of. It looks, like a kind of period doubling route to chaos. I mean, I can't say that. That's what it looks like. That's all I'm going to say. I'm going to put anything more concrete than that. So yeah, that's what we're trying to get at here. It would be nice to start getting at that more analytically. At the moment, we're trying to look at more analytically at cases where we see sort of stable, steady state solutions that are non-trivial, and trying to understand. I think we're pretty close to proving that we can see them in certain cases, but I don't want to give too much away. And I think, yeah, it would be nice to get some more analytic insight into it. But this is what we have so far, this slide, basically.
May I do a question? I assume that you give the boundary condition, Dirichlet boundary conditions. What happens if you use Neumann boundary condition? Because sometimes they are more appropriate in these problems. This is the first question. What happens in spatial dimension 2? And if you have Another question, you have some stability results, at least the local stability results. Thank you.
Yeah, so yeah, first question was about the boundary conditions. So it's pretty difficult to use boundary conditions when you've got this kind of non-locality. Yeah, there's the equation, that'll do. When you've got these non-locality, it's quite challenging to use boundary conditions other than periodic ones, so like Neumann boundary conditions, because you need to think about what this means when you're close to the boundary. There's a recent paper by Thomas Hillen, and very recent, I think, this year, by Thomas Hillen and Andreas Budenschirm, that looked at this kind of problem for the case where we've got one species. I can say is the rather sort of not very satisfactory answer of, we're thinking about it and it's on our to-do list to have a look at that, but it's not trivial. I did some sort of numerics with Neumann boundary conditions, and I kind of fudged the non-local term at the boundary. I didn't do anything, just to see what would happen, and it looked like the pattern formation's kind of roughly the same. It didn't look like anything was being, was crazily different. But yeah, I didn't do that particularly rigorously because it's quite challenging. So yeah, the second question was in 2 dimensions. Yeah, again, so I'm afraid I have to give the same answer. Yeah, I'd love to see a bit more, do some more sort of visualization in 2 dimensions and stuff, and see what happens. But yeah, on the to-do list. And your third question was about stability. Yeah, I mean, so I mentioned some sort of local stability criteria in some simple examples. So where was the very simple one I gave? Oh, sorry about this. So I mean, yeah, here's one in a very simplest example. That's the pattern. So this is the instability regime, and there's in the paper in Bulletin of Mathematical Biology, wherever the reference is, we sort of, I wrote down the generic pattern formation matrix. I mean, it's not too hard to do, so you can, in principle, calculate stability regimes. It's just giving a nice equation like this doesn't happen when you've got an n by n matrix. But
thank you.
Okay.
Okay, I have a short question, Jonathan. So you talk about Turing patterns, but actually you don't have a reaction term in your model, right? So you have just the diffusion and the advection. So you don't have an homogeneous equilibrium around which the pattern forms. So so I think that there is some role played by the initial conditions, or not?
Yeah, I probably skipped. So what I skipped is the integral conditions. Did I mention them at all? I may have just.
Maybe
yeah. So
I missed that.
I completely forgot to say that. So there is an integral condition, which is also given. So the initial condition will give you. You'll have an integral of the initial condition across space.
Okay.
And that gives you. Yeah, and that integral will not change. So if you, so I think actually, yeah,
Okay.
I think in this case, in fact, I should have said, because this case used the fact that U1 and U2 integrate to 1 over the over space, and so U1 equals 1 and U2 equals 1 were your homogeneous steady states. Yeah, I did skip that. Sorry about that. Yeah.
Okay, fine. Okay.
So this becomes different if you don't have U1 and U2 integrating to 1, but have them integrating to some other value.
Okay, thanks. Okay, other comments? Okay, if not, we thank again our speaker for his very nice seminar, and
Just
Thanks,
apologize in
Jordan.
advance that I might need to head off before the end of the next speakers. So I have to take my kids to their karate class. So I'll just apologize.
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much anyway.
Thank you again. So I think we can resume in five minutes and start again at 4 o'clock. Or next. So Rossella, we are recording your talk, okay? Is okay with you?
Yes, no problem.
Okay, so our next speaker is Dr. Rossella Della Marca from Istituto Zooprofilatico Sperimentale della Lombardia e dell'Emilia Romagna. She will talk us about some challenging control problems in epidemic models. You have 40 minutes roughly for your talk. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for the introduction. Well, today I will present you some different control problems that are related to the spread of infectious diseases. I would like to give you just the basic ideas of the mathematical approaches we adopt and the main results we obtained without going deep into the tests that you can find in the corresponding papers. Well, just to start, generally speaking, mathematical models proved to be a useful tool for understanding the epidemic dynamics and estimating the effectiveness of protective measures. And in fact, research in this field is constantly evolving also because ever new challenges are launched from the real world. Just think of the ongoing pandemic. And we considered both general problems and specific applications, and we focused in particular on two critical aspects that are the qualitative and quantitative assessment of control strategies in order to face an epidemic, and the mutual influence between the behavioral changes and choices and the dynamics of the disease. And also, of course, the correlation between these two aspects. Well, the model we considered are the so-called compartmental epidemic models. I mean, they are models where the total population is divided into disjoint compartments according to the individual health status with respect to the disease. And in our case, they are described by system of ODEs, where the state variables are the sizes of the epidemiological compartments. And probably you know that this model originated from the well-known basic SIR model that takes the name from the three compartments that are here considered. I mean, susceptible, infectious, and remote individuals. And this models was first introduced by Kermack and McKendrick in 1927. And here, the main mechanisms are the transmission process of the disease that follows the so-called mass action law, beta SI, and the transition from infectious to removed state is instead a linear function with respect to I that represents the fact that the time in individual stays in fact as an exponential distribution. Well, so the model we will consider are more or less complex extensions of the SIR model. And as I said before, the first aspect we focused on is that of controlling the spread of an infectious disease. And to this aim, we incorporated into the dynamical system one or more control functions, U, that represent possible control strategies against the disease. For example, vaccination or treatment in case of human diseases, or also culling and isolation in case of animal diseases. And in order to shape these control functions, we adopt two alternative approaches according to the problem at hand. And the first approach we adopt is that of the so-called threshold policies. I mean, we assumed that the control function U is a piecewise constant function that switches on-off according to a citable threshold. And for example, the control could be active only when the disease prevalence is sufficiently high. And in such a case, the corresponding dynamical system becomes a piecewise smooth system, also called Filipov system. And what is interesting in such problems is to investigate the dynamic on the switching manifold, where sliding motions are possible, and the stationary sliding solutions are called pseudo-equilibria. Well, for example, we adopt this approach for studying localized culling activities in a metapopulation mathematical model for the spread of wildlife infections. For this model, we considered a wildlife disease that spread on two different patches that are spatially connected. I mean, animals can move from one patch to the other or vice versa. And the dynamics on the two patches follows an SI model, I mean a susceptible infectious model where the possibility of animal to recover is neglected. And the dynamics on the two patch is identical, except for the fact that in the first patch, culling activities are performed. I mean, specifically non-selective culling activities of both susceptible and infectious animals. And I would like to put it to you that non-selective culling is the only available strategy against wildlife disease, because other kinds of strategies such as vaccination or drug treatment that are usually implemented for human and livestock diseases, in such a case are not feasible because of the lack of resources, but also of diagnostic tools. So we focused on this type of strategy, and we compare the dynamic on the two patches, and we also considered two types of culling. I mean, a proactive culling, that is the constant control, and the reactive culling, that is the threshold policy. I mean, the piecewise constant function that is activated by a citable threshold for the disease prevalence in the patch 1, that is the controlled patch. So in such a case, the second case, the dynamics is that of a Filipov system that, as I said before, in such a case, what is interesting to study is what happens on the manifold that separates the region where the control is allowed from that where it is not. And on such a manifold, sliding motions are possible on the so-called sliding set, and they obey a given differential system that is given by a citable convex combination of the right-hand side of the system in case of no control and in the case of control. And the stationary solution of these systems are called pseudo-equilibria. So what we did is to analytically and numerically face this problem. We first derived the condition for the existence of equilibrium, pseudo-equilibrium. Then we characterize the stability, and we proved many interesting results. But probably the main result we found is that localized culling implemented in just one of the two patches may be self-defeating. I mean, it could lead to an increase of the number of infectious individuals in the other patch. And this result is, in some sense, counterintuitive. But we also found a biological explanation for this result. I mean, it is due to the fact that culling induces an increase of newborn in both susceptible and infectious compartments and in both patches, and this leads to a flush of new susceptible in the uncontrolled patch that provides, of course, a boost for the new infection. And so this is the first approach we used. But another possible approach one can use for modeling control functions in epidemic models is that of optimal control theory. In such a case, we searched for the optimal control function. I mean, the control U star that minimizes the costs associated to the disease, both economic and social costs that are represented by a given objective functional. And in such a case, the problem becomes an optimization problem that we faced in the framework of the theory by Pontriagin. And we numerically solved by using both direct and indirect optimization method according to the problem at hand. Well, to illustrate you this approach, I will present the problem of minimizing both the epidemic size and the epidemic duration when the resources available for control are limited. Well, for this problem, we started from a basic SIR model, and we introduced two alternative control functions that are the vaccination of susceptible or the isolation of infectious individuals. And here in the variable Z denotes the number of individuals that are vaccinated or are isolated up to that time. And between all the possible control functions, we searched for the function U star that minimizes the cost associated to the epidemic duration, that is the time from the first infection to disease elimination, and the cost associated to the epidemic size, that is the total incidence during the epidemic outbreak. And the novelty of our study is just in the first cost here, that is usually neglected in optimal control application in epidemiology. But this cost could be significant if we think, for example, of the prolongation of trade and travel restrictions during an epidemic. And another peculiarity of this study is that we considered an upper bound Z max to the number of individuals that can be vaccinated or isolated during the outbreak. So in such a case, we have an optimization problem with multiple constraints. And we face the problem first applying the Pontriagin minimum principle that allows us to pass from the problem of minimization of an integral functional to the much easier problem of minimization of a scalar function. That is the so-called Hamiltonian function. The Hamiltonian is, in this case, is here. And it is defined as the sum of the integrand of the objective functional and the scalar product between the right-hand side of the state system and the vector of adjoint variables. The name is Hamiltonian derives from the fact that with this procedure we obtained an Hamiltonian system of the state and the adjoint variables. So I would like also to note that the Pontryagin principle gives just necessary condition of optimality that in general are not also sufficient. But in such a case, we proved that for our problem, they are also sufficient for the optimality of the control. And the main results for such a problem that we proved is that the admissible optimal control are just bang controls. I mean, they can assume only the minimum or the maximum of their possible values. And specifically in case of vaccination, we found that there are at most 2 switching times from a value to another. And in case of isolation, at most 1 switching time between the 2 extreme values. And we also proved other more specific results, and we performed many numerical simulations that I did not report here, but I want to underline just a very important epidemiological result we obtained. That is that there exists a trade-off, we can say, between the problem of minimization of the epidemic sites and that of minimization of epidemic duration, because the 2 different problems admit different optimal control solutions that are not only quantitatively different, but also qualitatively different. For example, if we consider the problem of vaccination, if you want to minimize the epidemic duration, that is a capital T here, you have 4 possible control shapes. While if you want to minimize the epidemic size, I mean the total disease incidence during the outbreak, just 2 control shapes are admissible. Well, okay, so this concluded the first part of my seminar where I speak about the problem of controlling an epidemic. But now I want to talk to you about another problem we studied, that is the modeling of the human behavior in the spread and control of infectious diseases. Of course, when we talk about human diseases. In fact, for human diseases, it often happens that the adoption of protective tools is on voluntary basis. I mean, individuals can voluntarily choose to adopt or not to adopt the protective tool. And to model this voluntary adoption of protective tools, we first consider another function in the model that now we denote with h of t, that represents the rate of adoption of a voluntary disease protective tool. To model the dynamic of h, also here we adopt 2 alternative approaches. Well, the first approach is that of imitation game dynamics. I mean, we assume that the rate of adoption of H depends on the mutual learning between individuals. I mean, there are opposite groups in the population that have different ideas. For example, in the simplest case, we have 2 opposite groups. A fraction H that is in favor of the adoption of the tool, and a fraction 1 minus H that is not in favor of adopting the tool. And the dynamics of H will be then ruled by a so-called double contagion of ideas that leads to the following differential equation for H. Well, in this equation, we see that in the right-hand side, we have, first of all, let us look to the product H1 minus H that represents the contacts between the people of the different groups. Then we have a constant key that is a scaling factor and represents the velocity of the imitation. And finally, we have this difference that is called the net gain from the protective tool. And this is the difference between the perceived risk of not adopting the tool and the perceived risk of adopting the tool. For example, just to mention a very used framework is that of childhood disease transmission, where when the vaccination is on voluntary basis. And in such a case, we have two opposite groups, those of pro-vax parents and anti-vax parents. And we also investigated such type of a problem. And in particular, we analyzed the problem of optimal vaccine awareness campaigns when the velocity of opinion is much faster than the epidemic dynamics. For such problem, we start from a basic SIR model also here, where we have the natality and mortality terms with the rate mu, and we assume that a fraction of newborns, P, is vaccinated at birth. So it passes in the vaccinated compartment. And such fraction follows an imitation game dynamic, as I showed you before, where now the two opposite groups are the pro-vaccine and the anti-vaccine parents. And here the net gain from vaccination is the difference between the perceived cost of not adopting the tool, I mean of not vaccinating, and the perceived cost of vaccinating. The first cost is assumed as an increasing function of the disease prevalence in the community. And the second cost is assumed proportional to the number of vaccinated newborn. This is the cost of having vaccine side effects. And here we also consider a new term that represents the possible vaccine awareness campaign that addresses the anti-vaccine group, and are implemented for example, education or information campaigns, or also subsides. Well, the peculiarity of our study here is that, as I anticipated before, we assume that the velocity of opinion is much faster than the epidemic dynamics. I mean, we assume that the factor P here, that is a scaling factor, is much greater than the other parameters of the model. And this assumption is justified by the fact that we live in the era of social media, so opinions are extremely volatile. And with such assumption, we can pass from a differential equation for P to an algebraic equation that we can also solve as a function of P. And here P is written as a function of the other state variables and the model parameters. So what we did is to put this expression in the mathematical model, and we obtained now a bidimensional system in S and I. But however, now the right-hand side of the system is no longer linear nor convex with respect to the control U, because now U is under square root and inside the minimum function. But the model is not yet finished, because we have to determine the shape of the control function U. And for such a problem, we again applied the Pontiardi optimal control theory, and we searched for the control function U star that minimizes the cost associated to the disease incidence, the cost associated to the rate of vaccination P, I mean the cost for vaccination, And finally, the costs related to the implementation of the vaccine awareness campaigns. So we obtained an optimal control problem to solve. And as before, we first applied the Pontryagin minimum principle, which provides us for a candidate optimal control. But now, at variance with before, we have that classical existence theorems do not apply, because in our case, we have that the integrand of the objective functional and the right-hand side of the system are not convex with respect to the control. So it is not guaranteed that the Pontryagin conditions are also sufficient for the optimality. So what we did is to numerically face the problem by using both indirect optimization methods that are based on the Pontryagin Hamiltonian system, but also direct heuristic optimization methods that are based on algorithms of general use that directly minimize the objective functional. And what we obtain is a good match between the results of the two methods, so suggesting that the candidate optimal control that the Pontryagin minimum principle gives us is actually the true control, the global minimum. So we also I would also like to note that the optimization algorithm, the direct optimization algorithm used are heuristic, so they are stochastic process, and we needed to perform a statistical assessment of the solutions. We proved many interesting results, but just to mention one of them, we see that at variance with the case of volatile opinion studied here, the case of slow opinion speed, I mean the case that key has the same speed of the other model parameters, we see that the general behavior of the system in such a case is more complex and less conclusive. Well, so this is the first approach for modeling the voluntary disease protective tool in an epidemic model for the imitation game dynamics. Another possible approach I will present you now is that of information-dependent epidemic models. So in such a case, we have that the function H, that again represents the rate of adoption of a voluntary disease protective tool, depends on the information or rumors about the disease status in the community. And in such a case, the information is summarized by a settable information index M that is defined as a distributed delay, where the integrand of this integral is a product between the two functions. The function G, that is called the message function, and represents the information that are relevant to the public in determining their choice to adopt or not to adopt the tool. And the function key, that is the memory kernel, I mean, probability density function that represents the weight given to the past history of the disease. And in most of the application of this kind, we have that G depends on the disease prevalence or incidence, while key is an Erlang memory kernel, because it proved to be a good compromise between realism and analytical tractability. And for example, this approach, we adopted this approach to study the role of human behavior in the dynamic of vaccine preventable infectious disease when the vaccine is not perfect. I mean, it is not feasible to fully protect the vaccinated individuals. for this type of model, we consider the NSIS dynamics. I mean, this model is suitable for those diseases that do not confer immunity, so that infectious people return to be susceptible soon after the end of the infectious period. For example, for the seasonal flu. And we assumed that the vaccinated individuals can vaccinate, the susceptible individuals, sorry, can vaccinate with the rate phi. And phi is information dependent. I mean, it depends on the information index M. We assumed also that the vaccine is imperfect in the sense that its effectiveness can wane over time with the rate theta, and vaccinated individuals can still acquire the infection, even if with a reduced rate by factor sigma. And here for the information index, we assume that the message function is prevalence dependent, so it depends on the number of infectious individuals at that time. And the memory kernel has an exponential distribution. I mean, the collective memory of the disease is exponentially fading. So first of all, we computed the so-called basic reproduction number, R0. You probably know that R0 is defined as the average number of secondary infections produced by one primary infection in a totally susceptible population during the infectious period. And here, R0 is computed through the next generation matrix method, and we see that it is less than the corresponding number for the basic SIR model. And this is due to the fact that the vaccine is here imperfect, so greater efforts are needed to reduce R0 under the threshold 1. Then we performed a stability and bifurcation analysis of the model. Specifically, we proved that there exists a unique disease-free equilibrium, while there could be multiple endemic equilibria, both under and above the threshold R0 equal to 1. For example, in this figure, we have a possible bifurcation diagram in case of forward hysteresis, where we have 3 endemic equilibria above the threshold R0 equal to 1, and 2 endemic equilibria under the threshold R0 equal to 1. Then we studied the equilibrium stability, and in particular, we proved that multi-stability is possible when one or more endemic equilibria could coexist and being stable. And we also proved that the system could incur in Hopf bifurcation. I mean, an endemic equilibrium can pass from being locally stable to unstable, and corresponding Hopf bifurcation occurs so that oscillation of the system occur. And this implies the risk that the disease will reemerge periodically. We also performed other numerical simulations by varying the information parameters, and we test the sensitivity of the model to the information related parameters. But the main results we obtained are that both the imperfection of the vaccine and the human behavioral aspects are two risk factors for the control of the disease. And when these two aspects coexist, as in our case, we have that the possible dynamics scenarios are much richer than those predicted by models that include imperfect vaccines, but not behavioral aspect, or vice versa. Well, so I want to conclude with the last application of the information-dependent epidemic models. In such a case, a specific application to COVID-19 first wave in Italy. We investigated here the effects of social behavioral change during the first COVID-19 lockdown. And in such a case, we needed to consider a more complex model where we have 7 epidemiological compartments, and except for susceptible and recovered people, we have 5 classes of infected individuals that are the latent E, the post-latent IP, the individuals that are asymptomatic or mildly symptomatic, IM, the quarantine individuals, Q, and finally the severely symptomatic or hospitalized individuals, IS. And we assume that all the parameters are positive constants, except for the rate of disease transmission, beta, and the rate of quarantine, key, that are assumed to be information dependent. I mean, this reflects the fact that individuals could voluntarily choose to reduce their social contacts or to self-isolate if they suspect to be infected. And this choice is influenced by the information that are available about the disease status in the community. And here we have the differential equation corresponding to the diagram. And as far as the information index here, we consider that the message function depends on the number of quarantined and hospitalized individuals that is communicated every day. And here the factor key is the so-called information coverage. Then we assumed that the rate of disease transmission, beta, is information dependent and is in particular a decreasing positive function of M. And we also assume that beta is piecewise constant. I mean, we assume that beta can have jumps when one passes from a lockdown phase to another phase. I mean, when the restriction by the government are strengthened or are relaxed. And then we assume that the quarantine rate key is an increasing function in such a case of M, and a saturating function because we consider that there is a ceiling value for the maximum quarantine rate per day. And okay, so after building the model, we applied it to the case of the first COVID-19 epidemic wave in Italy for the period that stretches from February 24 to May 18, 2020. And we first set all the epidemiological parameters on the basis of the data communicated by health authorities, while we varied the information-related parameter by selecting those that best fit with the Italian epidemic curves. In particular, with the curves of the hospitalized individuals, that is in the right panel, in the third panel here, and with the curves of cumulative death, that is the fourth panel here. And we obtained a good approximation by choosing an information coverage of 18% and an information delay, that is the time needed for information to reach the public, of 3 days. I I would like to note that we choose the curve to fit as the hospitalized and the cumulative deaths because we consider the most accurate and reliable data at that time, while the other data were probably highly underestimated. And we then simulated the case of the responsive case, I mean the case of absence of reactivity to information in the population. And in such a case, what we found is that the model predicts a much greater number of cumulative cases that would have been about 30% more at 18 May 2020, and also a much greater number of cumulative deaths that would have been 50% more at 18 May. Then we also test the sensitivity to the model to information dependent parameters that you can find in the paper. But a very interesting result we obtained in some is that the social behavioral changes in response to information played a decisive role in curbing the epidemic curve.
You have a couple minutes.
Yeah, yes, I finished. So I just want to conclude with some remarks. As we have guessed, control problems in epidemiology are challenging because one has to formalize real phenomena that are affected by multiple and complex factors. Indeed, we needed to use disparate analytical and numerical techniques, but although some simplification adopt, our model captures some interesting and sometimes counterintuitive results that throw more light on the key mechanisms underlying infectious diseases spread and control. But our work did not finish here. We are now making progress in some direction. In particular, now we are investigating the optimal control problem in SIR model with the non-exponential distribution of the infectious period. We are now also studying a behavioral change model for COVID-19 vaccination, where we focused on the vaccine hesitancy and refusal. We are also approaching a new line of research that in some sense connects kinetic theory with mathematical epidemiology. And finally, there are also some other works in the fields of autoimmune disease and behavioral effects in landscape ecology. So I think that the time is finished, but also my presentation. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rossella, for your interesting talk. So we have a couple of minutes for questions or comments.
I have a question concerning the model with time delay. So you said that when the time delay was large enough, you had oscillating solutions. Is that correct?
It is not a time delay. It's probably you.
It was a parameter A, right?
Probably you are speaking about the threshold policy here.
That was the information delay, you said.
Ah, okay, yes.
The information index.
Yes, but what we have in this case is that by choosing an exponential distribution of the information index, you can pass from an integral term to a differential term. So finally, this becomes a differential equation that you put together with the other equations. Right, but then you said at a certain point that you had oscillating solutions. You had off bifurcation. Yes. For this model, we have off bifurcation. And having chosen as a bifurcation parameter A, right? Yes, exactly. This,
which is the information delay. I think it's I don't know. It's the effect on the system of the information. It's time delay. That's what I interpreted as a time delay for this reason, right?
Yes, yes.
And do you see only oscillating solution? If A is large enough, you see a more complex behavior?
No, just oscillating solution. No, they are
So, but you didn't see any chaotic solutions when A was getting bigger?
No, there are only periodic solution, but no other type of solution, not.
Mm-hmm.
I have also a question regarding this off bifurcation. Do you have any clue about the fact that if the off bifurcation is supercritical or subcritical? Because in the second case, you could have coexistence of oscillations with the equilibrium. And so you
no,
could have...
in such a case, it's supercritical.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, no, there is no coexistence. No.
Okay. Are there other questions?
No, I mean, if you think it's feasible to, because you don't have any special structure, but maybe did you make it something like 2 patches, like you did in the first part of your talk, like a network, of maybe just 2 nodes. In the first part of your talk,
Yes.
You call it patches.
Yes, I return here.
Uh-huh.
Here, yes.
Right. So you have 2 patches communicating somehow, right?
Yes, in a deterministic way. Just a rate from one patch to the other, but not with a spatially explicit term.
Right. So I was wondering if you saw that controlling one patch could have a paradoxical effect on the other patch, right?
Yes, exactly.
So did you try something like that for the model with vaccination
No, because for this kind of diseases, for animal diseases, vaccination is not implemented. Just
so you just scaling, yeah, but
yes. So we did not see the effect of vaccination.
Okay. Good, thanks.
You're welcome.
Okay, so thank you very much to Rossella for your talk. It was very, very interesting. And so, well, for today, that's all. I thank you all the speakers, 2 speakers of today, and all the participants. Before closing, I want just to recall you that next Friday we will have a new webinar. The next talks next Fridays. The speakers will be Professor Tommaso Ruggeri. He will talk about thermomechanical extension of Cooker's male flocking and Kuramoto oscillators. And we will also have a talk by Carla Perrona. She will talk about Lyapunov stability of laminar flows, paradoxes, and experimental comparisons. So who has already been registered on the Google form does not need to register again. So you will receive the link to the Google form next Friday in the morning, and you will receive also the advertisement on email with all the infos and the links and the necessary links to participate. So thanks again, and we are looking forward to seeing you next Friday.